Um, Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for this seminar on reconciliation and the restoration of trust and relations in Groningen. And I want to especially welcome our two speakers for today, Katherine Stroebe, professor in social psychology here at the University of Groningen, and also head of the research group Gronings Perspectief, that researches developments in, amongst other things, health and well-being and trust in the earthquake region in Groningen. And also welcome to Nurit Shnabel, professor in psychology at the University of Tel Aviv, where she's also head of the Improving Social Relations Lab. Nurit's planned visit to Groningen originally was the occasion on which we wanted to organize this seminar, and we are incredibly happy that you still wanted to join us from Tel Aviv today, even though your travel plans fell through because of COVID restrictions. Before we start, let me also introduce myself. My name is Sanne Hupkes. I'm a project researcher at the kennisplatform Leefbaar en Kansrijk Groningen. For those of you who don't know the knowledge platform, we share, gather and analyze knowledge about the societal impact of gas extraction and ground movements in Groningen. And one of the things we have found in our research over the last years is that the way in which various actors have dealt with this impact of gas extraction and ground movements in Groningen has actually caused damage to many relationships between various actors in Groningen, and it has also damaged trust. Material restoration, it remains the top priority, and this is the fortification or the reinforcement of buildings of which the safety has become compromised, and also the repair of damages. Yet what we also see is that this material restoration is increasingly difficult when relationships and trust between these various actors is damaged. And it's especially difficult to execute this material restoration in a way that feels adequate and sufficient to all the actors involved when all these actors don't trust each other and the relationships are bad. So this is the reason that we wanted to start this conversation in the seminar that we're doing today about reconciliation and the restoration of trust and relations. What would this entail in Groningen? So in this seminar, we want to explore mainly how scholarly insights can play a role in this conversation. We want to start a more abstract discussion, possibly using references to other cases around the world, and from there explore how these more theoretical and abstract insights can also aid the discussion about this topic here in Groningen. So in that sense, I also want to emphasize that we would like to, so from the knowledge platform, would like to consider this meeting really the start of a conversation, of a discussion, and we hope that it generates new insights and fosters new connections also, possibly between professionals in the field and scholars as well, and that we can follow it up with future events that can then also be followed up with some drinks and where we can actually meet each other in person. We really hope to be able to do that in the future. In the meantime, if you want to make a connection with anybody as a result of the seminar today, please also contact us if we can play a role in that, because we're really happy to facilitate fostering these connections where possible. So for the seminar today, we will proceed as follows. First, Katherine Stroebe will give a presentation on the context of the situation. So she will talk about trust in Groningen and based on the research results of Gronings Perspectief. And then there will be a presentation by Nurit Shnabel. And then after that, we have time for a discussion. We hope you want to join us for that as well. I'd like to ask you to save your questions and comments for that last bit. Then you will have the opportunity to raise your Zoom hand and use your microphone and possibly camera to join the conversation. That was it from my side. So Katherine,
yeah, thanks.
I think the floor is yours.
Upload my screen, which I see is not anymore on the first slide. Just a minute. Okay. Yeah, can you see it, Sanne? Yeah, Great. Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation to talk about our research project here in Groningen. It's a great topic to talk about, and one that was difficult to confine to 20 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. So what I talk about today, we'll talk about is, for those of you who don't, because I know it's a mixed audience, who aren't fully aware of the context in Groningen, I will give you a little background in which I also discuss why it's important to think about trust in Groningen, why it's a relevant context. And then I'll bring in the research results that we have regarding trust, or at least a selection of results. Just going to see what time I started. Yes. Okay, so just to give you a little background, since registration in the 1990s, we've seen earthquakes in the province of Groningen. There are people also who have reported them from the 1980s onwards. And as you can see in this graph, the number of earthquakes and also the intensity of earthquakes has increased over time. And as you can also see, even in 2021, we still have earthquakes, even though gas extraction in the province has been reduced, because these earthquakes are due to gas extraction. I think what's important to realize is that we're not talking about a situation where houses are collapsing or people are dying due to earthquakes, but these earthquakes are felt quite strongly by inhabitants, and their greatest consequence is the damage to housing that they bring with them. And this damage to housing is incremental over time, and that is also one of the reasons why I referred to this as a chronic disaster at the beginning of my talk, because for people this is something that has been going on for many years, and their houses are slowly getting more and more damages. What's also important to realize is the role of different institutions here, and I'll come to those in a minute as well. But here it's important to mention the gas extraction is being done by the National Gas Company, but the national government has quite a large profit in this from this gas extraction, and that means that they have earned over time a considerable amount of money based on the gas extraction. I read something like 417 million euros before 2019. And much of this money, unlike in some other countries, has not gone back to the population in Groningen. So it's not like they got part of this income that went to the government. There wasn't a sort of collection of money for them. And another point that's just important to mention at this time as we look at these earthquakes is also that for quite a long time, it was denied that the gas extraction actually caused earthquakes. So only when there was a larger earthquake in 2012, the earthquake of Huizingen, which had a Richter scale of 3.6, was there more awareness of the fact that earthquakes cause damage to housing. And only then was it also something that was more openly admitted as being possible. So I think in relation to talking about trust, this is also important information for you. Let me just give you some insight into the extent of the problem here. So this is one of the most densely populated areas where gas extraction takes place. And that means that a lot of people are affected by the gas extraction. And depending on which numbers you look at, we can say that there's about 630,000 inhabitants for whom damage would be possible. It's possible that they have damage to housing, and it's judged that there are about 390,000 inhabitants who experience moderate to severe damages. So not a small number of people who are dealing with the consequences of this gas extraction. And as Sanne already mentioned, the national government has come up with what is seen as a solution, partly for the problems caused by the gas extraction. So there's a fortification procedure which is meant to ensure the safety of buildings. Doesn't mean people can't have damage in future, but it does mean that they should be able to leave their house without being killed if there were to be a larger earthquake. I'll discuss a little in more detail just briefly in a minute that this procedure takes a long time. It means that people's houses either have to be quite extensively fortified, often means people have to leave their houses during this procedure. It can also mean that people's houses have to be pulled down and rebuilt as a new house. Again, this hits quite a large part of the population. This is the number here that you can see, 26,917, the number of buildings that need fortification. and 10% only have been fortified since the fortification started in 2016. So usually I now give a presentation in which I discuss the health impact of the gas extraction, because that's something that our research has shown since 2016, that when people have damage to housing, this is really a stressor, and it, especially for people who have more than once damage, we see a significant decrease in mental health among these inhabitants, meaning that they have more stress-related health symptoms, they have more depression-related symptoms, and their experienced health is also much lower, considerably lower than people who don't have damage in the region. That was a very impactful, at least at the time, for us and for other people too, I think, results, something that we've been studying ever since, and we still see this difference between people with no damage and with multiple damages. But that's not what my talk will be about today. But I think it also makes clear that damage in itself is an important stressor in this dossier. Okay, oops, sorry, just going to go to that. Yes. Now the question, of course, is why am I talking about trust here today? Why is it important to study trust in the context of Groningen? And I'd like to, so mine is not really a theory-oriented talk. That's not what the aim was. My aim was to give you a context and the study results. But I'd like to just give you one way of looking into the results that I will present that I think is very relevant in this context, and that is work on antecedents of trust. The question of what makes a trustee trust a trust. So what makes someone trust another person or organization? And the three dimensions that you can take into account there that are important. You're more likely to trust someone or an organization if you think that they're competent, that they're good at what they're doing. You're also more likely to trust someone when you feel they're benevolent, that they're not just looking out for their own interests, which could be financial, but also importantly, looking out for your interests. And finally, and that's very closely related to benevolence, is integrity. The question of whether someone else upholds important principles. For example, is that person honest? Is it a moral person? And these three dimensions have been shown to be very important in how people determine whether they trust somebody else. And without going into a lot of detail in this talk, I hope it'll become clear to you that these dimensions also under threat to some extent here in Groningen, and can partly, we would think, explain why there is some lack of trust in this context. So I'd like to just move on to the context, and you will see that these three dimensions come back as I do so. So I think a very important actor in discussing trust here in Groningen is the national government. And in 2015 already, the Dutch Safety Board brought out a report about the earthquake risks in Groningen. And one of the really important points that they brought up here is that the government has a conflict of interest regarding the safety issue, so the fact that they have to ensure the safety of their inhabitants, versus an economic and financial interest, the fact that they earn a lot of money from the gas extraction, and that also they are the ones who determine the level of gas that should be extracted in the region. And when this report was written, these two controlling functions that the government has were located in one ministry, and the report asked to separate the safety monitoring from the financial economic interest in separate ministries. That is something that occurred many years later, but at present, a lot of responsibility for the gas extraction is now again being put back into one ministry. Another point that is relevant in understanding trust, and I think important to why we should be studying trust here in Groningen, is that the very many procedural problems in this region, which we outlined in a report. Marielle Bovenhoff, who's also attending this seminar, is the first author, and here we showed, we interviewed professionals, and some of the main conclusions were that procedures are not very difficult running, not working very well, that there's a lot of procedures are slow. There's different organizations, many different organizations involved with very many different interests, and it's not clear who actually is leading this whole operation. And within these procedural problems, I think you can discuss two separate lines that have been problematic for citizens. The one is the damage procedures, so people can be compensated for damage, but especially from 2012 onwards, that became problematic as the people were concerned about the independence of the organizations meant to reimburse damage. They also had the feeling they had to fight for damage reimbursement. And on the other hand, this fortification procedure has been going extremely slowly, and people have to wait very long from hearing that their house is unsafe to actually having their house fortified. And again, they feel that their financial compensation is problematic here. So again, both these, one is the solution and the other is, the fortification is meant as a solution, the damage procedures is meant as compensation, but both are problematic procedurally as well. So this is a little background as to why it's important to study trust in this context. Another one is, I think also scientifically interesting, is the fact that, as I mentioned already in the previous slide, a lot of organizations are involved in this gas extraction, organizations and people. So you have the inhabitant and you have action groups supporting inhabitants, such as what's called the Gasberaad and the Groninger Bodembeweging. We measure trust in a lot of these organizations, which is why I'm mentioning them, but also at a lower level, you have the National Gas Company, you have the company National Coordinator Groningen, who's responsible for fortification. You have the organization responsible for damages. We have the local government that more recently became involved also in fortification as co-responsible for fortification. And then at the more macro level, we have the national government, who is seen as overall responsible for solving the problems in the gas region. But again, there are under the government actors who are actually meant to work on the resolution thereof. And from a trust perspective, that was why this talk was really difficult to prepare, because you could talk about everybody. And these issues are all extremely intertwined. And I think the trust literature approaches it more simply. There you would either study at an interpersonal level trust between two people, or you would study at an organizational level the trust between an employer and an employee, or in a political context, you can study whether people trust the government and how it affects voting behavior. But this study of trust is extremely complex and very pervasive at all levels, and it's really difficult actually to give a full description of how this works in the region. So I'm preparing you for my next slide, which is extremely complex, because this is the first study result, but I'll walk you through it. Okay, so I'd like you just briefly to focus on the right-hand side, and I've tried to organize this in colors. So maybe just let me describe briefly what you see here. So we measured people's trust over the years for some people, for some organizations from 2016 onwards. That's the y-axis. And we distinguished whether people have no damage, once damage, or multiple times damage. So you can see the different lines here. And let me just focus you first on organizations that are involved in the earthquakes to some extent, such as the national government, the local governments, the gas company, the national coordinator. What you can note if you look at our results for those organizations, the organizations in black, is that for those who have multiple damage, we see that they have less trust in these organizations. So those who are most strongly struck by the disaster also have lower levels of trust in organizations involved in the gas extraction. I think that's the first result I wanted to show you. The second is that if you just look at levels of trust, so it's a scale from 1 to 5, but if you look at the red neighborhood, you will see that people have most trust in neighbors. And to me, this shows the importance also of social networks. And we also see it doesn't matter whether you have damage or not. People just have high trust in their neighborhood. And finally, you will note, if you look at the means, that the people have lowest trust in the national gas company. And so one could say this is what we need to focus our study of trust on. We should work on reconciliation of trust in the gas company. But I think what I'd like to show you today also is that that is not where the pain lies. I think the greatest pain probably for people is this lack of trust in the national government, who is also seen as ultimately responsible, I would think, for the problems that are taking place here. So this is the first slide I wanted to show you regarding the trust results. And the second one I want to show you just briefly to give you a full idea of what we've been studying. So this is the most recent update also, again, of research. And what you see here, and I want to just focus on that one briefly, is that trust in particular in the national government has really decreased in autumn of last year. And it's decreased, unlike the previous slides, partly for everybody. So it's decreased for people with damage, but also for people without damage. And I can't tell you why. There's many reasons for that. It could be the way the government's dealt with the pandemic, or the fact that other affairs were playing quite a salient role in Holland at the time, such as a tax benefit affair. Could also be that in the autumn, the level of gas extraction was, whether it should be reduced as much as was planned, was again slightly under discussion as well. So we don't know exactly why we find these results. Okay, those were the numbers regarding our research. Also, I'd like to just give you some insight into how people talk about trust, because I think it gives a good idea also for Nurit's talk of what trust means to people here. So we have here one citation saying that somebody describes why they think there's low trust in the region. People have been sent from pillar to post for a long time, ever-changing rules and organizations, money that doesn't go to the people, but to all kinds of organizations and to research. I can imagine there's no more trust. People are becoming despondent and fatalistic, and that's the fault of Shell, NUM, and the government. So you see here, the government again plays an important role in the discussion about trust. And we see issues that are related to the trust dimensions that I've talked to you about. So the fact that people don't know where to go when they have problems. So it's not effective, the systems that have been instated. They say there's too many rules and organizations. They distrust the system. They say money should be going to the people, but that's not what's happening. And from a health perspective, this is something we've also seen, that people indeed over time have become despondent. I could give a whole talk about all these dimensions, and Marielle is writing a really fascinating dissertation on this. So if you're interested in this, you should definitely contact her as well, because she can talk a lot more about also her work on interviews with professionals regarding trust in the region. That's really fascinating. I'd like to move on just to a second point that I think is important. As I was thinking about this talk, I thought why would I say that it's the trust in the government where the pain lies? Well, let me just explain this first with a citation. So one of the professionals we interviewed said to us, to create trust, you actually had to honor commitments that have been made. Well, we couldn't honor them because we couldn't get things organized. And I think that is at the level of execution in the area, especially in relation to the fortification, one of the big problems, that rules keep changing. So professionals make promises, but they can't keep to them. People think their house will be fortified within the next 4 months. And again, the date is shifted. People think that they will be fortified in a certain way. The governmental rules change and they have to have their house reevaluated. So what people expect versus what is promised and what they ultimately get, there's a big discrepancy here. And I think that is one of the main problems. But it's not just at the level of execution, it's also regarding the actors. And I think that is why the pain lies so much with the national government, because again, for example, things like there's been a promise that gas reduction will be reduced, but again, it came to discussion this January. And I think people have the idea that a government, especially in a democracy, should adhere to, have the interest of the population in mind, and that if you work hard, you will get what you should within democracy, and that that you are the center of the democracy and people will do well by you, or the government has your interest in mind. And I think what's happening here in the region is that for people it's becoming very clear, and has become clear, that that's not possibly the way that it works for them. And this has even pervaded to the level of children. We did research among children, qualitative research, and you see that the adolescents also have these doubts about the government. So finally, I'm coming to the end of my talk, but I'd like to just end with two more points. The one is that there's many ways to say, I had a lot more information here and I took it out again, but there's many ways to say that we do need trust in the region and why it's considered essential. And actually Sanne referred to this briefly too. But I think what made this all very clear too is when we asked participants in our most recent questionnaire how they felt the region could be rebuilt. So what did they think was necessary to rebuild the region, to sort of get back to a state of what it had been before all this gas problem, became more salient and the problem started. And of course, for some people, rebuilding just isn't even a topic they can think about yet. But for those of them, that was a considerable amount, nevertheless, who could. You see that many did mention material damage needs to be reimbursed. So obviously things like my house should be, I want my damage reimbursed. But a lot of people also mentioned, 45% of those who answered, that immaterial damages needed to be reimbursed, the fact that they have really suffered from these earthquakes. And within that answer, 38 of the 45% mentioned trust as a very important concept. So they said that only if we reconcile or give back people their trust in the government, only then can we start to rebuild the region. And this citation here below makes that very clear. First of all, the trust in the government, the mutual distrust is so great, it is often difficult to come to good agreements about repair and damage compensation. So people are saying that they can't actually even start to repair what's the region or their house without having some sense of basic trust that has been lost over the years. And I think this is a really nice introduction actually also for the necessity of talking to Nurit about her very important research. So just before I leave and give the word to Nurit, I just want to give you what I think are the main points of my talk as a take-home message. I think that exposure to chronic disaster, I hope I've shown, undermines trust in institutions that deal with the disaster. And I think part of the problem really is the inability of these complex systems and many organizations to actually address what is the need of inhabitants. And within that need and within what needs to be done, there needs to be elements of ability, benevolence, and integrity. That's where part of the problem lies. And I think a lot of the pain and what we've also seen in the past months, for those of you who live in the region, lies in what you expect a government to do versus what they are witnessing happening. And just to end, I think I always find this a very important citation by one of the professionals who said to us, I think in this whole complex operation, we just forgot what it actually does to people. So I'd like to end my talk with that comment, and also not end completely, but also thank the many people who have been involved. I was leader, Tom and I, until 2020, together led this research project. And since 2021, I have been leading it together with Michel Dukers, and there's a big team has been involved in this very big and very fascinating project. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for this insightful talk. I think especially for the people not super familiar with the situation in Groningen, there was a lot of really interesting information. I was just wondering myself, a small thing about the results that you get from Groningen's perspective in terms of trust in different organizations, whether and how you see that trust in different organizations is related to each other. was, for example, thinking about the moment that the government took over responsibility for damage repairs and for the fortification. And was that accompanied by an increase in trust by the government, or actually the opposite? And does the trust in the government relate to the trust in the gas company, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I cannot fully answer. I mean, that is indeed when I said that trust is pervasive and showed that diagram of all those different organizations involved, then I think that you know, they're very intertwined, because what the government does, new regulations, plays directly into how the national coordinator who does the fortification functions. And so it's extremely intertwined. And I think what's really interesting also, and I meant to look this up before the talk and I forgot, is indeed that at some point the local government got a more responsible role within the fortification. And I think, but I haven't checked this, that indeed also influenced levels of trust in the local government at the time. So you know, they come under a vergrootglas, is the Dutch word, under a lens suddenly as soon as an organization gets involved. And I think any kind of involvement in this dossier is always extremely tricky. I think it's something you'd probably rather not burn your fingers on, because it's very difficult to maintain trust, I think, and do well. Also, it's just extremely complex. We also see a lot of professionals working very, very hard to do their best. It's just that doesn't translate necessarily into always into positive outcomes for inhabitants. But that's a really good question, Sana. Thanks.
No, thank you. I think then we can move on, Nurit, to your talk if you're ready, or unless you short question for Katherine as well, of course.
Sorry?
Unless you have a short question for Katherine as well, then please go ahead as well. Otherwise.
No, I wanted to tell something to the audience that Professor Stroebe has very interesting also findings about the connection between trust and voting behavior. So maybe I'm just, you can ask about it later, because I saw a previous version of this presentation. So.
Yeah, had to take it out. It was too long.
Yeah, so I'm telling them to ask about it, because I think it's okay. So I'll share my presentation, and okay, I will first of all say that I'm very happy and honored to be a part of this seminar, even though it's not face to face, it's virtual, and I thank you for inviting me. To be honest, now we're I live in the Middle East, so when I thought about Groningen, I thought about it as a very idyllic, paradise-like place. I still think so when I see Sane's window. I see people riding on a bike. It seems very pastoralic. So when Sane and Agustin, who organized this seminar, approached me, I was surprised to hear that there are problems in travels in paradise, and that I was sad to hear about the earthquake situation in Groningen. And obviously I'm not an expert on the situation in Groningen, so the purpose of my talk is to share with you some broad insights about reconciliation and the restoration of more harmonious social relations through research that was conducted by myself and other researchers, other social psychologists from other parts in the world. And hopefully these insights will be valuable for thinking about the situation in Groningen or interpreting the situation in Groningen. I will begin with the distinction between conflict resolution and reconciliation. Since the birth of social psychology as an independent field of research, much attention has been devoted to the study of conflict and conflict resolution. And this research was based on the realist approach to conflict resolution, to conflict settlement. So the underlying assumption was that conflicts are grounded over disputes about tangible resources, such as money or land or property, and that the involved parties are motivated to maximize their utilities, namely to gain as much as they can. And therefore, conflict resolution means reaching an agreed upon formula, such as a peace treaty or a contract or a reparation mechanism for distributing these contested resources between the involved parties. And reconciliation, in contrast, tries to capture something else. This concept tries to capture the emotional aspects that are involved in the process of harmony restoration. And actually, it was introduced into the scientific discourse rather recently. It was the famous Dutch primatologist, Frans de Waal. I'm sure that many of you, or perhaps all of you, have heard about him. So he introduced this concept into the scientific discourse. He studied chimpanzees, our closest relatives, for many years. And because it is a very violent species, the focus of the research about chimpanzees was on violence and conflict. But at a certain point, de Waal realized that they must have some kind of an evolved mechanism for restoring relations following conflict, because at the end of the conflict, the aftermath of the conflict, they need to cooperate again and to live together again. So he started studying reconciliation. In humans, it is believed that the mechanism that evolved in order to promote reconciliation following conflict is the apology forgiveness cycle. And social psychologists became interested in studying the apology forgiveness cycle and reconciliation processes because there has been a growing use of the apology forgiveness cycle in the public sphere over the last 2 decades. So just one example, in 2008, former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, apologized to the First Nations peoples, to the indigenous population, for the policy of residential schools. And the same happened in Australia, also in 2008. And just to make sure that you're all familiar with the incidents. So for many years, the policy, both Canada and Australia, was to forcefully take out indigenous kids from their homes and put them in residential schools. And the idea was to make them Western and to eliminate the indigenous culture. So what we now view as a form of cultural genocide. And in many cases, they also went through abuse in the schools. For example, they were punished for speaking in their native tongue. And in 2008, initially the government wanted to give generous compensation to the victims of the residential schools, but they insisted that an official apology is crucial for the process, for the healing process, for the reconciliation process. So eventually that what happened. And my point is that in the recent 2 decades, the language or the discourse of apology and reconciliation has entered the public discourse. And before that, people used to apologize and forgive, but it was done in the private sphere, in interpersonal relations. And we can define reconciliation as comprised of 3 components. First and foremost, as Professor Stroebe mentioned, is mutual trust. And so this is a crucial component of reconciliation. I will just mention that besides the trust of the citizens in the institutions, such as the government, another problem is that the government or other institutions also sometimes don't trust the citizens. So for example, in Sderot, it's a town in Israel that is very close to the border with Gaza. It is often suffers from rockets, and the government or insurance companies often suspect that the people exaggerate the damage caused to their property or exaggerate their mental health problems in order to get more compensation. So the problem of trust, lack of trust or mistrust is bidirectional. And maybe it's like that in Groningen, I'm not sure. Another component of the reconciliation is equality. And again, here in Groningen, it is clear that there is an asymmetric power. On the one hand, there are citizens, and on the other hand, there is the government or national gas or the gas company or institutions. So there is an inherent, one side is inherently weaker and has less voice than the other side, which is another obstacle to reconciliation. And the third component of reconciliation is positive identities. My personal research has focused on this dimension, this aspect of reconciliation. So I will elaborate on it a bit more. My research is based on theorizing on the big two theorizing in social psychology. Many different theories in social psychology converge on the understanding that there are two major content dimensions along which social targets, such as individuals or groups or institutions, are perceived and judged. These two dimensions receive slightly different terms and slightly different labels in different theories, but they converge on the understanding that one dimension refers to traits such as competence or agency or dominance or power or respect or having voice. And in short, it means that being able to determine your own outcomes. And the other dimension is sometimes called warmth or communion or friendliness. It is associated, or love, it is associated with one's relations with others and being perceived as moral by the others. And according to the needs-based reconciliation, which is the theoretical perspective that I developed to understand the dynamics between victims and perpetrators, victims experience a threat or impairment to the agency dimension of their identity. So they feel lack of control, lack of power, that are not respected, that lose status. And perpetrators experience threat to the moral social dimension of their identity. So they're concerned about their moral identity. And because both individuals and groups are generally motivated to have positive identities, they're motivated to restore their positive identities. So victims are said to experience a heightened need for empowerment. The perpetrators are said to experience a heightened need for moral social acceptance. These needs can lead them to, for victims, it can lead them to vengeful behavior in an attempt to regain power. But to the extent that the perpetrators apologize to the victims, then it means that they admit owing a moral debt to the victims, and then the victims have the power to decide whether or not this debt will be canceled. And this restores control to the hands of the victim. It empowers the victim. Other way through which perpetrators can empower the victims is by acknowledging their value, acknowledging their competence, and to the extent that victims restore their sense of agency, they have a higher willingness to reconcile with the perpetrators. Perpetrators are said to experience a heightened need for moral social acceptance. We call it acceptance because the sanction that is imposed upon those who violate the moral standards of their community is their social exclusion or rejection. A good example would be the embargo on South Africa during the apartheid. And to the extent that perpetrators, and again, perpetrators can restore their positive moral image in ways that are harmful for reconciliation, for example, by moral disengagement, by undermining the severity of the transgression. But they can also restore their moral image to the extent that victims express forgiveness or understanding of their perspective and of the circumstances that compel their behavior. And to the extent that perpetrators restore their positive moral image, again, they're more likely to reconcile with the victims. The idea that restoring victims and perpetrators' positive identities can increase their willingness to reconcile with each other, can increase their generosity towards each other is perhaps counterintuitive. We know that victims are often concerned that if they express any understanding of the perpetrator's circumstances or why they behave this way, then they are likely to encourage more licensing. More licensing means that perpetrators will use these expressions of empathy or understanding of their perspective in order to excuse their behavior or justify their behavior and avoid taking responsibility. So victims are often unwilling to express understanding of the perpetrators and their perspective. Perpetrators, on the other hand, are often concerned that if they express an apology, if they take responsibility, then this apology will be used against them. So, for example, the victims can use that in order to further condemn them or to make further demands. So again, perpetrators often avoid expressing apology and acknowledging the injustice caused to the victims. But it seems that in many conflicts, this is not the case. What we often see is that if victims and perpetrators receive what they need, address, satisfy their needs, then they're more likely to engage in constructive dialogue and be more open to reconciliation or to restoring the harmony with each other. A famous example of this is in this study on an American, a US hospital. And in this hospital, they decided to change their policies in case of medical errors. And in any case of medical errors, to take full responsibility, full disclosure, and including an apology. And this change in policies, following this change, they went from being one of the highest net legal cost hospitals to among the lowest net legal cost hospitals in the Veterans Affairs system. And again, at first glance, this seems counterintuitive because in cases of medical errors, hospitals often try to hide that an error occurred. They try to minimize the consequences of the errors. But if you think about it, when victims sue the hospital for the medical error, they need two things. They need compensation, and they need it. For example, if due to a medical error, they now need a wheelchair, so obviously they need money in order to cope with the new situation. But they also want to know the truth. They want to know what happened. They want to feel that they want to have justice, and they also want to believe that such incidents won't happen in the future. So they need to know what happened and to feel that through their case, at least the lesson will be learned and things like that won't happen again. And all these more psychological needs can be achieved through the apology, through the policy of full disclosure. So this is one study that supports the argument that an apology can reduce the lawsuit and compensation. Another interesting study was conducted in the Netherlands by Sven Zebel and his colleagues. They study restorative justice procedures. And again, just to make sure that we're all familiar with that, restorative justice procedures are focused on restoring, mending the relations between victims, perpetrators, and the communities. They often involve encounters, or always, I think, involve encounters between the victims and the perpetrators, and sometimes often, always also people from the community. And they're often constructed with the traditional criminal legal system, which focuses on punishing the perpetrators. And what Zebel and colleagues found is that to the extent that perpetrators believe that through these encounters with the victims, they have a chance to feel reaccepted to the community from which they feel potentially excluded, then they are more motivated to participate in the process. I should explain perhaps that the restorative justice procedures are not mandatory, so perpetrators and victims have to decide, have to choose whether they want to take part in such victims offenders mediation. And what they also found is that to the extent that the perpetrators feel that they are reaccepted to the community despite their offense, then the chances of reoffense are lower. if we come back to the situation in Groningen, again, I'm not an expert. From what I've read about the situation and how it evolved over the years, and Professor Stroebe also mentioned how things evolved and how initially the damage by the gas extractions was unacknowledged. So my humble opinion is that perhaps an official apology may be in place, but it is important to remember that apology is not the end of the healing process. In this staircase model of intergroup apologies that was developed by researchers from Canada and Australia, they found that for members of the perpetrator groups, in this case, it was white Canadians and Australians, non-Indigenous Canadians and Australians, they perceived the official apology as the end of the reconciliation or the healing process. And by contrast, the Indigenous population, the victims, members of the victim group, viewed it as an important step in the reconciliation process. They viewed it as a step in the right direction, but not the end step, but rather as one step in the process. So it's important to remember that there are always gaps between the victims and the offenders in terms of what is the meaning of an apology in the process of reconciliation. And another important concept that I wanted to bring into the discussion is justice. According to justice restoration theory, victims are concerned about restoring their status. Can be viewed as empowerment in terms of the model that I presented before. They want to gain control, respect, having their voice heard is very important, but they are also concerned about the values that were breached by the transgression. So victims need reaffirmation or revalidation of the values that were violated due to the transgression. And when I heard Professor Stroebe talk, I thought that it is very. I heard very, it was very clear to me that one of the values that were breached is that the government's commitment to the citizens, and so it's important to, in order to restore the sense of justice, it's important to restore these shared values, to restore the feeling that there is a consensus that the government, that the national government is committed to the good of its citizens. And one last thing is the distinction between different types of justice. And again, from what I heard from Professor Stroebe talk, I felt that perhaps the component of procedural justice was the most important and perhaps lacking in the process of reconciliation or compensation. Procedural justice in this case would mean transparency, would mean clear information about the process of compensation, what are the principles of it, what is the timetable. And we know from research in other contexts that especially when people are in a vulnerable situation, for example, minority groups, again, in other social contexts, they often care more about procedural justice than about the outcomes themselves. So I will stop here and thank you for listening. And I'll also just turn on the lights.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. And I will be so bold to ask a question myself before I open the floor for the rest of you. I was just wondering, because a lot of these things really resonate, I think, for people that are working here on the situation in Groningen and that are familiar with it. You also pointed it out yourself already here and there. So for example, that bidirectional lack of trust, but also the power imbalance between government and citizens. And I was wondering whether and how you find that this also translates into the willingness or the openness to engage in constructive dialogue and reconciliation for all the actors involved. Because I can, for example, imagine that if a process of reconciliation may address the injustices done in a very particular situation, but it does not necessarily address the power imbalances at place. So does that also influence this willingness to engage in reconciliation in these instances?
Yeah, I would say that the answer is positive. Of course, it's very difficult. So my theorizing about the importance of equality in terms of power is more relevant to situations in which we have minority-majority relations, for example, between Arabs and Jews in Israel. Here, I think the imbalance of power is inherent because it's a citizen versus an authority. But I would say that perhaps a procedure through which the voice of the citizen is heard, getting them involved in the decision-making processes should be, I think, valuable for the willingness to engage in a constructive dialogue. So there needs to be a procedure to have the citizens involved in the decision making.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to open up the floor for questions for all of you. So if you have a question, please let me know. And I believe you can unmute yourself actually to ask a question to either Professor Stroebe or Professor Shnabel. Katherine.
Yeah, I have a question very related to Sanne, so maybe the answer is the same, but I just needed to ask it because it's been bothering me since your presentation as well. I think indeed that equality question that you were speaking to and that you just mentioned in your answer to Sanne, I was wondering whether your model with the importance of agency versus that moral dimension for perpetrator versus victim, whether the agency would still be the most important dimension when relations are so unequal. I'm just not sure. I mean, I think in the context of Groningen, agency and being involved in decision making is important, but I somehow have the feeling that that's not where the crux lies, not fully, because it's also just about your needs being taken into account, which is not the same as having agency. So I'm not sure that agency is required to achieve what is needed here. So I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts on that, also based on your knowledge of the resilience literature.
No, I'm afraid that I'm not familiar enough with the situation, but my thought was that if the procedures are decided only from the top down, then it is less, I think it is less effective or less efficient in restoring positive relations than if there is also a bottom-up process. That was just a very general thought because I'm not familiar enough with the situation.
Yeah, I actually think that if we can integrate that as part of having agency, I think that would be very important as well. So yeah, thanks. I'm going to think about that one a bit more too, because I think it's really interesting to think about I think it would be interesting to compare studies looking into restoration of trust, depending on the type of relation between the truster and trustee. What is needed in those kind of situations, because I think, yeah, it's interesting. So it's an interesting dimension. Thanks. And thanks for your very interesting talk too, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gwenda?
Yes, thanks. Thanks to both of you for very inspiring talks. I have a question for Katherine. I was wondering, because on one of your slides, I believe it wasn't the last one, but the one just before, there was a quote in which you used the term mutual distrust. And then seeing Professor Nurit Shnabel's presentation and including the element of mutual trust, which is an element of reconciliation of this healing process. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how this mutual distrust is in Groningen, because you mostly discussed it from the perspective of the inhabitants, but I was wondering how this works from the side of the government, and then both different levels, so local and also national.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Not terribly easy to answer because there's so many levels involved, as you just mentioned. Because Mariella, for example, also interviewed professionals who interact with inhabitants. And what we saw there is actually that there's mutual trust as well, in that professionals are quite trusting of inhabitants and feel that they deal with the situation well and actually admire how they deal with it. And inhabitants, to some extent, also trusting of professionals in that they realize that they're, doing their best for them, but that they're kind of handicapped by the organization they're part of, and to some extent unable to give them what they want due to the rules and regulations imposed by their organization and by the national government. So at that level, I think we started studying trust at that level because we were interested in it there, but we realized that wasn't exactly where we needed to be. And I think the trust issue, the mutual distrust, comes more into play when indeed you look at the level of organization versus inhabitant. And you mentioned the national government. I think part of the problem, and I'm not sure, I'm trying to think of whether I can base that on our research, but certainly of what I've perceived of the situation as it is now, is that a lot of what's happening is based on a sort of, all the rules that we have are based on a fundamental, I would say, distrust of inhabitants too. The fear that if you give too much money or if you make procedures too easy, that people will grab the money, they'll claim damages where they shouldn't be, or they'll want their building fortified far too extensively, or, everything is partly, it's also the type of organization the government is, but partly I have the feeling there's also something of a distrust of inhabitants to, just want what they need rather than want more than they need. I can't base that, by the way, I don't think, on our research. I can base it on, what inhabitants also tell us, that they have the feeling that they're not trusted. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yes, it does. And I have the same feeling. Okay. Also not based on research, but I think, it resonates.
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah, thanks again, both Nurit and Katherine for great talks. On this topic of trust between different parties, I noticed actually that Augustin's hand is also raised. Maybe that's something that you also wanted to say. But Nurit, also for your information, the situation in Groningen is really complex, because if you examine, well, for example, the idea that there is one perpetrator is really complicated by the fact that there is a corporation involved and government, and it's not one government, it's a whole system of government. And over the time, government is actually hid first behind the responsibility of the corporation. And now many government agencies are involved. So there's absolutely no perpetrator anymore. And this also creates very unfortunate situations, because there's nobody to apologize, right? Who could say sorry in this situation? And Mariella, in her dissertation, talks about this as, in some sense, the ghost in the machine. It's a system in which also power vanishes, right? So there's a, and I really like your talk also because it alerts us to this puzzle in Groningen, that the perpetrator has vanished, right? There's no responsible villain anymore, and it would be handy to have one, because then there would be somebody who, and then in relation to trust, and that's where Agustin comes in. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. This is a really important point and a complex puzzle, because all these agencies involved don't trust each other anymore. So there's distrust of citizens towards state and industry. There's distrust of both state and industry towards citizens. They're greedy, they exaggerate their claims. So they can't be trusted to report their problems truthfully, that kind of stuff. There's also huge distrust now between industry and state. And then within government, there's huge distrust between local government and national government. So it's like a distrust fiesta. I mean, if you try to identify the parties who do still trust each other, they're very far and few between. And so this is all in relation to the previous debate. I'm not asking for a clarification there. I'm just pointing out this. It's a really interesting, from an intergroup relations, a traditional intergroup relations perspective, to clearly identified groups, clearly identified roles in a conflict. In a conflict, this is a really nasty one where the perpetrator has vanished. It's gone. It's in the cloud, in the mist somewhere. The cloud has a different meaning. Agustin, sorry, I may have just inadvertently removed some of your contribution, but you've been interviewing people about this point recently, so maybe you have something to add.
Well, it is true. I wasn't going to ask specifically about that, but it is absolutely true that just the separation into groups of a victim and a perpetrator here is almost impossible. Everything is completely fragmented, as Tom said. These models are very good because they give us an indication of where to go, but then whenever you cannot identify who is who, it gets very, very complicated. I've also noticed the incredible mistrust that happens between layers of governments. So making a unit of these things super challenging. But I did have another question based on what Nurit explained. From the needs-based model, I get that the perpetrators here need social acceptance. They need to be embraced again by a community, and also from the Sable, the article that focuses on the emotional needs of perpetrators. I think that is really important, and I think it plays a very important role here. I think they're actors who have needs, and those are not being identified or addressed. I was wondering, how can we apply these theories to organizations, to, in this case, a corporation or the different layers of government? Because there's not an ethnic group, or this is not a person, an individual we're talking about. Can we apply these theories to these actors?
First of all, I think that also in what Tom said is that it's not an easy translation, because these are a difficult situation and diffusion of responsibility, I think, between different actors. I did think about one thing that was perhaps when I thought about the denial of responsibility, I thought that for the side of the government, I can say that perhaps until a certain time, they didn't know that the gas extraction, because from what I have read about the situation, initially some people said that the earthquake are related to the gas extraction, and others, but even scientists that were impartial, not with an interest to say that it is irrelevant. So I think in that sense, perhaps it is possible to in that sense, perhaps the understanding the perspective of the perpetrators. Again, I understand that it's not clear-cut perpetrator, but I would say that yes, no, that it's not translated once we're dealing with authorities or different actors instead of one group, as in those Australia and Canada case.
I would like to add on that.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I was also thinking about this agency aspect in your model. And I read another article from Sven Säbel that is also very important, that the perpetrator shows some kind of suffering and responsibility taking. So some feelings of guilt, so that the victim is aware that the perpetrator knows what happened was wrong. And if I think back on the agency, I think that's a term that comprises many different things like power, as you say in your article, but also say the feeling that you have been taken seriously, so that the perpetrator respects you and your needs. So I would say it's also important for the victims, because I mean, primarily I assume that they have they want some financial compensation, of course, but also the feeling that the government takes them seriously and doesn't let them alone with their problems. And so, from my perspective, this is the psychological need that resolved. And I think to some extent the government did resolve this, because I read on their page that in 2018 they set up the Tijdelijke Commissie Mijnbouwschade. So, and I understand this as a step to show the victims, well, we acknowledge your losses and your situation, so we try to solve it somehow.
I also saw that someone wrote in the chat that the Prime Minister Ute apologized.
Yeah, I'd written that in the chat. That was in response to Tom. I don't know actually what Tom exactly said at that point in time, but oh yeah, I think Tom said that it wouldn't be clear who should apologize. And so I was actually, just as we were talking about apologies, Googling Rutte, and he's actually apologized about a lot of things, because I first couldn't find the gas extraction, but this was one of them. The fact that I had to Google it, I did remember that he apologized. I think at that time it was appreciated, but you know, I think your point of it's like Boris Johnson, you know, if apologies don't come with actions, then it doesn't mean that much. And so yeah, that's I think an illustration possibly of a similar point here, because it's not like after the apology the situation in the region dramatically improved for people. It has improved in some ways. I mean, I agree that the damage procedures have been placed in more independent institutions, so there have been improvements, but for inhabitants, there are too many problems left still.
Thank you all. I think Otto has a question as well.
Yes, thank you for, it's really inspiring these presentations, and good to see Nurit again after many.
Yes, I wanted to say hi.
Yes.
Also in the conferences, wow, I think many years ago, and I was very inspired by your work on the police.
Yes, yes, and my question is a bit linked up both to Katherine and to you. I study a lot of police-citizen interaction. What you see a lot there, also the complexity, and probably Groningen is even more complex, with so many different actors involved. It's not just about the police, it's the police about different levels, not just individual officers, but like a local police team, and then the police as an institution, and others. That makes it very complex. That has been addressed already. But what I also see a lot, and I was wondering how much that you see as well, that participants, especially also the let's say the official participants or stakeholders, don't see it in relation terms, sometimes explicitly do not want to see it in relationship terms, or cannot see it in relationship terms. We are just applying the law. Don't see that it's like, well, in the case of Groningen, that it's not just about earthquakes or damage or money. And that's part of what complicates it. Well, that they just cannot or don't want to see it in those terms. I wonder how that resonates with you.
For me, again, as an outsider, when I first read about the situation, the most striking thing for me was the lack of safety. If you're living in your own house and you're not safe, this is, I think, it's worth more than any monetary damage, or it's the harm is worse than any monetary damage. This is thing. And another thing is that, again, the loss of trust in the national government. And also, I felt that the housing, I read that the prices of the housing might decline. So you don't know if you are able to leave your house, if you're tired of the situation, you want to leave to another place, you don't know if you will be able to sell the apartment. So all these insecurities, I felt that it's very difficult to live like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, I think at the end of my talk, I also mentioned that point where somebody said in this whole wood of rules, we've actually lost the people behind them. I think that's a very important point. I mean, it made me think of a context Tom and I were in many years ago where we were talking, among others, to the national gas company, and somebody came up to us and said they didn't understand why people didn't feel safe because their calculations had shown that they should be safe in the houses. And I think that illustrates your point too, the sort of inability to understand what safety is, that it's firstly, it needs to be guaranteed by an external organization not involved in the problem. But secondly, that safety, as Nurit said, is also about knowing what your future will look like and when your house will be fortified and that your damage will be reimbursed without too much effort. Because I think in our recent report that we brought out, we actually said that it wasn't so much just the earthquake and the damage to our house, but it's also all that goes with it. We called it gedoe in Dutch, the to-do that people get involved in when they have damage, the trying to get it compensated, the long wait before your house is fortified, and sometimes combined with a report telling you which wall is going to collapse if there were to be a greater earthquake. But you know, rather than somebody then the next day coming and mending your wall and your house, you have to wait for 1 to 2 years if you're unlucky, or even longer. Yes, I know, or even longer, 6 yes. Before that happens. And I've known, I mean, we have somebody in our board of inhabitants who's been waiting since I've known her, which is 2016 indeed, for the fortification of her house as well. So yeah, that in answer to, I agree, Otto, so that would be my analysis too of the situation here.
Thank you. I think Mario, you have a question as well.
Yeah, I was wondering about this dynamic between the how do you call it, the perpetrator and the victim. I've been in a very interesting lecture by Ruward Gansenvoort. He is a theologist in Amsterdam, about the way in a community when something really violent happens, the role of perpetrator is being assigned to different people, and people who feel victimized, they are looking for somebody to assign the role of perpetrator to. Well, when I walk through Groningen, I meet people, and they in the talks that I have, I hear very many occasions and very many people who get this perpetrator role assigned to them. Which gives them the idea of being a victim. And it transcends the original relationships between government and inhabitants. It's also between inhabitants. And this is something which worries me quite a lot. And I was wondering, do you have any idea how to stop this this ongoing cycle of victimization and assigning the perpetrator role?
Can I just ask Mario, because I think it's a question for Nurit, but could you just explain why one inhabitant would be seen as a perpetrator, just to give the context for us? I think that would help.
Yeah, well, people judge each other. There's lots of feelings of jealousy, of not being able to cope with it anymore, but your neighbor speaking endlessly about what's happening. People try to shut themselves off. I heard it in Schildwolde. It's a village, Nurit, where There's very, very, very unequal distribution of the chances to get your house fortified. Some people have this little signs in their garden saying, we don't speak about fortification anymore here. I know a case where when people get fortified, they have to move to another house while their own house is being rebuilt or fortified. Two people living opposite from each other, they are put into concurrention. They fight about who has the right to stay in this temporary housing, who gets the best housing, and it's really there's such scarcity in the handling of the fortification, and also the damage that people see each other as not their. No, okay, I think you understand.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer. The first, I think, is perhaps like a fatigue. The first situation that you described is that people are getting tired of discussing this issue over and over again. And maybe I think that for some people it's a healthy response. And the second, I think, is that what you're saying is that because there is a competition over scarce resources, like the new housing, and then it creates a negative atmosphere, or hostile atmosphere. I wish I knew, I wish I had a good answer besides increasing the resources, because the second situation that you're describing is like what they describe in the real conflict theory, that there is actually competition over scarce resources. That it's not just a psychological issue that are perhaps not always easier to solve, but really a competition over scarce resources. And I wish I had a good answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if you can look at this in terms of like, so I'm not a psychologist, this is the disclaimer, in terms of how group identities also come into existence, because I can imagine when a group is being victimized, this also strengthens their identity as a group. So, for example, recently there was a torchlight procession here in Groningen, and there you see that various people from Groningen gather around what may not even be a shared cause. It's just a general identity, a thing that people feel that multiple injustices, I think, are being done to them. So part of it is related to gas extraction, but then I also saw a lot of signs of people protesting against the closure of a specific department within the university hospital here in Groningen. So in that sense, it actually strengthens maybe, I mean, this is very loosely based on some observations, that strengthens the identity of the people of Groningen as a group. But then on the other hand, I guess the slow motion aspect of the disaster that is unfolding is then again putting a lot of pressure on these in-group relationships as well. Is this something that resonates with other types of long-lasting conflict for you?
The only thing that comes to my mind is that Erwin Saub, he studied, but that's a very different situation, but he studied post-genocide Rwanda, and I mean, it's a much more severe, thankfully, right? It's a much more severe situation. And he argued that when there are difficult life conditions, then it also leads to more violence and aggression. But what you're asking is how it is possible to transform the situation from leading to more cohesion instead of to less group cohesion.
Yeah, so maybe avoiding this idea of competing in victimhood or something. I guess that's
yes, we're saying when we study competitive victimhood, then usually one of the ideas by Johanna Moldhardt is to have an inclusive victim identity. So if people, instead of thinking about, but again, this was research that she did in Rwanda and in this type of conflict area. And the idea was to induce people with perceiving victimization not as something that is unique or competitive or exclusive in nature, but rather as a more inclusive category. So if I think about the situation that Mario described, am I pronouncing it right?
Very good.
then maybe it is possible to induce people with a common inclusive victim consciousness or common victim identity. And the idea is that they share their experiences of suffering or share their identity, that what is common to them in terms of their suffering or injustice caused to them. But how to do that?
I was very pleased with the fakkeloptocht. The walk, I don't know, Sanne was mentioning as a very important event. But thinking about reconciliation, also because we get these parliamentary interviews this summer, I expect an increase of anger, distrust, things like that. Victimhood, experienced victimhood by the time. What I'm looking for ways to support Groningers in to resist this competitive mode. So the one is like the fakkeloptocht, but maybe some kind of dialogue might help also. Do you have an idea on that? What might help?
But beyond, I think that again, it's beyond the idea of sharing. That's what the literature would say: sharing common identity as either regional identity or common identity as victims of the situation. But how to induce that is not easy.
No.
Well, can I, Sanne, can I add something? I think, yeah, we're looking for a way of translating your general advice, Nurit, to the Groningen context in a way that makes sense. And again, this is something that's very difficult to explain about Groningen. But you know, if it would be one clearly defined region that would be affected, there would be a shared identity involved that's already in place. But it's not one municipality, it's 5 or 6, or you know, nobody even really knows. It used to be 20 or something like that. We have a lot fewer now. It's not the entire province. It's also some people in northern Drenthe. It's not one a class of people, and so it hits people in very particular and divisive even ways. And there's another factor, which is that it's stretched out over time. And a final factor that I wanted to point out, that Bea is here too. I think, Bea, you're still active in the Groninger Bodembeweging, eh? But it's something that I've just talked about with Willem Gispe, whom you know, and it will be in the next blaadje, the magazine of the GBB. That on the activist side, there are multiple activist organizations, and they don't just serve one agenda. So both institutionally or in terms of activists, organizations, there is not one body to represent these people. And I think that therefore this is a complication, but Mario, really, I think that what Nurit is trying to say is that we should look for what we have in common. And if it's just being the victim of these circumstances, then that itself, well, you're nodding no, maybe because you think it's not enough. But I think that that's the puzzle that Nurit is saying we need to solve in Groningen, or we need to solve that needs to be solved here, right? So what's the commonality? And by the way, Sanne, I thought that your answer, I thought, you know, you could be a social identity researcher. You were trying to say something similar like this as well, right? So, and this is really like an ongoing problem. I think Katherine and I have observed this since we started doing research on this in 2013-14. Who is being affected? It's not one body of people. And it's certainly not individuals, right? This is a collective problem. But what defines this collective is still not identified. And I think part of the thing in your question that you're identifying is that the government in this doesn't take its responsibility of uniting the people, right? So next time the staatssecretaris, the Secretary of State comes and talks to you, maybe Mario, then you should remind him that he really can help us a lot by uniting the people in this, right? And in fact, what they're doing through their policies is the opposite. The policies are intrinsically divisive, and this is an area where government can actually take responsibility, I think. But I agree with you that if on the ground, in one-on-one conversations with people, this is a devilishly complex problem to address. Katherine, you were.
Yeah, I was just, so we're focusing a lot on an identity as a victim, and I was just wondering whether that would be the most important identity to focus on, because I mean, I think what I showed in my talk too, and what we've seen over the years, is that this trust in neighbors is really important. And so it could be that it's important to find what you jointly have, not just as victims, but also as being neighbors. So to obviously acknowledge that you're all suffering in different ways from the gas extraction, so that everybody's different, but also what you do share as a village. And I think in the research that Tom and I did with focus groups, in which we asked people what made their village cohesive, you see that if you have people who really want to pull new initiatives, so some kind of leader, if you have municipalities that have close connections to inhabitants and are willing to help set up new initiatives, that in a broader sense helps for the cohesiveness of neighborhoods and villages. And I think that's problematic at the moment too, because the municipalities have just got a lot bigger, so the lines to inhabitants are longer than they used to be. But I guess because I think it's nearly 5 o'clock, but my point would be maybe not just victimhood, but you know, take it a little more broadly if you want. I think a lot of people need that when they're saying we don't want to talk about the gas extraction anymore. They're asking to have some kind of distraction as well, and to share something else together. So to me, that might be a direction that one could take. But yeah, that may be something that we can study in the future as well. But that would be my addition to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also like how we are finishing up on a slightly more positive note, if I may interpret it that way, because I do think we've run out of time. Nurit, I would like to offer you the opportunity for some closing remarks after all you have heard now, if you'd like to take it. Don't feel obliged to do that.
No, I would hate to keep people after the time, and because we also discussed the Zoom fatigue, I was afraid, and I'm happy that people stayed all the way.
Yeah, I'm also.
I thought that maybe Katherine, if you have concluding remarks about the voting, I thought it was super interesting data, and maybe you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think not at this late stage. So if anybody's really interested in that, you can send me an email, but I think that's kind of a bit too complex. That's why you made me take it out of my talk too. No, you didn't make me. It didn't quite fit the topic, even though it's very interesting. So if anybody's interested, I'm very happy to send me an email and let me know, but I won't Zoom fatigue anybody right now with my voting results. But thanks, Nurit. I'm happy to I hope we can meet at some point and talk about them as well.
Yeah, I also want to thank, well, firstly, the both of you, Nurit and Katherine, for willing to engage with us in the seminar today. Thank you very much. I will take the fact that we went a little bit over time as a sign that this is indeed the start of a conversation that we can hopefully continue at other occasions in the future. And just on the content of this seminar, I am intrigued by the fact that I start off saying I want to have an abstract talk about these various theoretical insights, but I'm also struck by the fact that the situation in Groningen seems so complex and so particular in so many ways that we also immediately get drawn into details again, which I don't want to label as a bad thing, but just wanted to point out that this is really the challenge of the discussion that we're having here. And I think also shows the importance of continuing this discussion at future events. So thank you all very much for participating today. If you want to stay in touch with the Knowledge platform, you can sign up for our newsletter on the website. I just wanted to mention that. And we have another event coming up next week, which is a knowledge cafe where we will be able to be physically present and meet you in person if you'd like to at the Forum in Groningen. You can also find the information on our website. And for now, I wish you all a very nice evening and thank you again for participating, especially Katherine and Nurit for your contributions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nurit. That was and Katherine and Sanne. That was really good. So I really hope that we can continue this conversation in Groningen sometime soon. So let's keep in touch. And I think Nina was still going to invite you, right? Nurit?
Nina, yeah, I think that right now Nina has a very difficult family situation with her daughter is positive, and I think that she has problems associated with the wearing mask for many hours. So I hope that things will get back on track for her.
Yeah, I think that Dutch society is likely to open up very soon again, and then we will have fewer restrictions, but we might still have difficult situations at home, of course, due to the virus circulating. It's very virulent at the moment. At any rate, let's find another moment for you to visit the department and to continue this conversation. It'd be lovely. But thanks so much for your